policy for the 12th District. Mary's the chair of the bank's Diversity Council, committed to creating an inclusive professional environment. In fact, she was singularly responsible for changing the hiring process of new research analysts at the Fed, shifting a decades-long big gender gap to, in 1 year, achieving a 50-50 balance in the incoming research analysts through a deliberate no excuses program. Mary's research focuses on topics including labor economics, economic inequality, wage and unemployment dynamics, and disability and retirement policy. She has collaborated with scholars to create effective and sustainable public policies, has published numerous articles, and edited several books. She began her career here in San Francisco as an economist through a somewhat unlikely path, and after completing a National Institute of Aging postdoctoral fellowship at Northwestern University. She holds a PhD in economics from Syracuse University, an MS in economics from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and a BA from the University of Missouri in Kansas City. Please welcome Mary Daly.
Thank you. Oh, there's the stairs. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be here. One of my good friends is a CFA. She works on the East Coast. And when I told her I was coming here, she was grilling me. I don't want you to give them any information that you already haven't given me about the economy, but I got that covered. So it is my distinct pleasure to be here this afternoon. I thought I would talk about a topic that we are thinking hard about at the Federal Reserve, and I'm sure you are as well, is sustaining the economic expansion. We're now in our 9th year of the expansion. We're closing in on being the longest expansion in our history. And it's an important question to ask, how do we keep this going? We know that strong and sustained expansions are very important, and so how do we keep it going? So today what I'll talk about is the current economic condition, what's going on in the economy today, what the outlook is going forward, and then importantly, how this balancing act between making sure that we avoid runaway inflation or imbalances otherwise, and making sure that we bring all the workers into the labor force who could participate, how that balancing act is done so that we can get a healthy and sustained expansion. Now, before I begin, it's a good time for me to give the disclaimer that I need to give, which is that the remarks I'm going to make this afternoon are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco or the Federal Reserve System more broadly. So let me begin. The first thing I want to talk about is that the economy is in good shape. It's actually in great shape. The economy is really in great shape. Domestically, we are very, very strong. GDP growth is nothing short of robust. We're slated to grow at 2.8% this year. That's the consensus forecast, really, if you look across forecasters. And that's a full percentage point above what we think of as the sustainable pace of growth. Of course, with a high or a fast GDP growth rate, you get strong labor market conditions, and we are already at what we would gauge to be full employment. There's a little bit of disagreement about are we at full employment or below full employment, better than full employment. But either way, the economy and the labor market are going gangbusters. We're continuing to add jobs at a rapid pace, despite the fact that we're in our 9th year of an expansion. That's an unusual aspect of our current expansion. And unfortunately, we have inflation approaching our 2% target. Now, if you look at the current data on inflation, we're at 2%. Core PC is at 2%. Headline PC is at 2.3 on a 12-month basis. I put approaching. I'd say we were reaching it, but we're really looking for sustained 2%. Because remember, we have a 2% target, and if we just touch the target every once in a while at 2% and then fall below, that's not really what we mean by price stability. So our dual mandate is full employment and price stability, and we're very close to achieving, if we're not having achieved, both of those. At the same time, that's a perfect place for a central banker to be, by the way, is that you have full employment and you have inflation near the target. That's a really good place. We also have notable tailwinds in the economy, though. And this is going to be important when I talk about sustaining the expansion, because in addition to having the strong momentum there, we have these tailwinds that additionally push the economy forward. And I would argue that those tailwinds are supportive financial conditions. While they've tightened, of course, because interest rates are going up, albeit slightly, financial conditions remain quite supportive of a strong growth. The other thing we have going for us is we have good global growth. Global growth has slowed a little bit since last year, but global growth in general is a boost to the economy. It used to be a headwind, and it's now a tailwind. And then, of course, we have the fiscal stimulus. So the fiscal stimulus is very much in the news. We had both the tax package that was lowering corporate and individual income taxes, but we also had the big spending bill, and those provide impetus to the economy in addition to the momentum that was already there. So all of these things make for an economy that if I could write on the slides in real time, I would X out good and put in great. An economy that's in really great shape. But if you're thinking about policy, you actually want to think beyond just what's the economy doing today, but also think about what's the economy doing tomorrow. I know you all think about that quite a bit in your roles. And so I want to talk a little bit about the outlook. And here, the outlook is bright. And I would say it's actually surprisingly bright given the number of years we've been in this expansion and the strength we've been running above our potential. How fast we've been growing, how low the unemployment rate is relative to their long-run values. So what I decided to do in this chart is the following. 4 times a year, the FOMC, all the participants at the FOMC, they submit projections of how they think the economy is doing in GDP growth, unemployment, inflation. And what they then do is they put that out for everybody to look at, and one of the numbers that they put out is the median of the FOMC participants. So just the midpoint, these can be different individuals, but the midpoint of the range of projections that were submitted. And what I've done here is I've put up on this table the median for all the variables I'm interested in across all the years that they give me the information for. So let's start with the first row, which is real GDP growth. And what you see is that much like we forecast at the Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco, the expectation of the median of the FOMC projections is 2.8% growth for 2018. So at the close of this year, the economy would expand to 2.8%. In 2019, growth slows, partly because some of the fiscal stimulus boost wanes, and partly because we're gradually normalizing interest rates and monetary policy, but it's still 2.4%. And even in 2020, 3 years from now, you get growth of 2%. Now that's all really important numbers to think about when you realize that the long run value, how fast we can grow when we're at steady state or we're on a sustained path, is just 1.8%. So in 2018, the median FOMC projection is 2.8% growth against a long run value of 1.8. So we're growing 1 percentage point faster than we expect to grow when we're really in equilibrium. So that's a pretty robust growth. And we expect that trend of being above potential to persist well into 2020. With that kind of strong GDP growth, of course, we get strong labor markets. And here, the next row is the unemployment rate. And what you see is, again, sort of the unemployment rate. Let's look over to the longer run value first. You see 4.5% is the longer run value. That's the median of the projections. Our own estimate in San Francisco is similar to that. And that's just the rate of unemployment you would observe in an economy that's really growing at a sustainable pace. Not too tight, not too loose. But unemployment is fully a percentage point below that in our forecast, our expectation. And right now it's 4%, but it was 3.8% the month before. Essentially, we're expecting the same thing that this median suggests, we're expecting unemployment to hit 3.6, 3.5% in the coming years and remain a full percentage point below what we think is the long-run sustainable pace. And I can talk more later if anybody has a question about how do we compute a long-run sustainable pace or rate if the actual data is falling so much below that. But right now, I just want to kind of get your benchmark right that GDP growth in the longer run, 1.8%, unemployment rate, natural rate of unemployment, 4.5%. Both the projections on both those variables are much better than what the long-run sustainable levels are. Then the final two rows are on inflation, and I want to point these out because this is a 2.1 for, this is headline, PCE inflation is headline, and then core PCE that excludes the volatile food and energy sectors. That's your core. And what you see is we're at or slightly above target. Now we've been projecting that we'll be at target for some time, but inflation data have been coming in disappointingly below target for several years. And so what's nice about this picture now is I can show you this table and say the expectation is we're going to be at or near target, and the data are coming in saying we're at or near target. So again, if you're thinking about central banking, you want to, and you have a dual mandate, full employment and low and stable prices, then you actually think this is a pretty good situation to be in, where you've hit your inflation target, you're getting near it, and you're below what your estimate of a full employment economy looks like in terms of the unemployment rate. So consistent with this, the FOMC then says, well, we want to have a sustained expansion. So how are we going to keep the expansion going? Well, we're going to gradually normalize interest rates. So this is just a plot from the same projections that I just referred to from the FOMC for June of this year, so June 13th, which is the last time they produced these projections. You see the actual funds rate, and then you see the projection in blue of the expected funds rate going forward, how much interest rates will need to rise and how quickly they'll need to rise for policy to gradually normalize. And I want to call your attention to a couple of things. First of all, this pace is pretty gradual relative to history. And the second thing is that it's going up, but it's not going up to a level of 5 or 6%. It's going up to a level closer to 3%. And that's because ultimately, and this is an important thing we can talk about later as well, ultimately we think the landing place for interest rates going forward is going to be lower than the landing place for interest rates in the past was. This is famously called R star, the neutral rate of interest. There's a lot of discussion about R star. R star is just the neutral rate of real interest rate that you would expect to persist when the economy is functioning at its potential. And not too hot, not too cold. And then you add the real interest rate to inflation, and you get the nominal interest rate. So right now, the FOMC median is 0.9 for the neutral rate of interest, so R star. And then you have a 2% inflation rate. You think the final funds rate, when it settles in, is going to be something close to 2.9, and not something close to 4.5 or 5. So that's just something to keep in mind. We have a lot of new normals in our economy, and that's one of the new normals. So when you're thinking about financial markets and how high are interest rates going to go, it's really important to think about re-benchmarking yourself to these new normals and asking what are the ending points going to be. So that's one of the ending points that I wanted to point out. So now I told you I was going to give you an outlook, and a brief review of the economy, and then the outlook, and then pivot to, so say you're sitting at the central bank, what are the challenges that face you? And the challenges that face you are that you've got a balancing act. So you want to sustain the expansion, and you're already at full employment, and you're already at your target inflation rate, but you want to keep the economy going. And what you want to do in particular is you want to avoid high inflation. So you don't want to run the economy too hot or you'll get high inflation. But you don't want to run the economy too cool or pull the punch bowl away too fast, raise rates too quickly, or get ahead of the curve and not behind the curve. And because you want to be able to fully engage the workforce. You don't want to leave any people on the sidelines who you may not be counting in that unemployment rate. And that's really the crux of the debate. If you read the participants' speeches, or you look at the discussion of the minutes of the FOMC, or you sit in any central bank research department, this is what we're thinking about right now, is what data should we look at, and what analysis should we do so that we can figure out how to do this balancing act, and we don't end up with high inflation or pulling away too quickly, raising interest rates too quickly and leaving lots of people on the sidelines. So what I want to do with the remainder of my time is just go through what we're doing in our research in San Francisco, and other places in the system are doing exactly the same thing, trying to think about these two issues. How are we doing on the high inflation? Are we doing, are there any danger signs on inflation that we should be paying attention to? And then how are we doing on fully engaging the labor force? So that's the remainder of my talk, is just what are the basics of this balancing act? If you don't mind, I'm going to take off my jacket. Now that you've seen me looking like I can wear a jacket, I'm going to go to the fact that San Francisco is particularly warm today. And I'll just put that there. Okay. So avoid high inflation. If I'm thinking about how to avoid high inflation and trying to inform policymakers about that. What are the things I want to look at, and what's the story that I want to understand in order to know that I'm not going to get in this high inflation environment? In other words, are there danger signs out there now that we need to pay attention to? So let me start with one that really gets a lot of press, and that is wage growth. So the way economists think about this is that wages and compensation, total compensation, is about 2/3 of cost for firms. Most of what firms pay is us, people. And so that's the first place we want to look if we're looking for inflation pressures, is in wages. But right now, wage growth is only slowly ratcheting up. And the wage growth line is that gold line, and it's on the right axis. The numbers for it are on the right axis. And the unemployment rate, which I've plotted against it on the left axis, is the blue line. And what I want to point to is, I wonder if I have a laser. No, I don't. What I wanted to point to is the fact that unemployment went really, really high, and then it dropped like a stone. And it's been falling nearly continuously since 2009. So it's just going down, down, down. But you can see wage growth has been a little choppier, and it was very slow to come back up. And since about 2016, it's been coming up gradually, but much slower than many people expected it to come up. And so if you were thinking that inflation is right around the corner, that we might have 2% inflation now, but we are just right around the corner from having some big pressures that are in the pipeline, they're going to build up and get out of control pretty quickly, you're not going to see that in the wage data, because the wage data seem pretty constrained. There's nothing right there that tells me that I should worry that we're going to get runaway inflation tomorrow or next quarter or next year even, because it's going up gradually. We also don't have a lot of information looking at across sectors. So one way you think, well, you could say, well, Mary, that could be true, but that's an aggregate statistic, and maybe it's being pulled down by sectors that are doing much worse than other sectors. And some sectors are going gangbusters, and the rest of those sectors are going to follow. Or maybe some regions are doing really well. We hear this all the time. Regions, the Pacific region or San Francisco is doing really well, and we're just the canary in the coal mine, and there's going to be a lot of other regions doing well quickly. And then the final one is you might think, well, certain skill sets are being paid highly, but the other skill sets aren't, but we want to watch those. So what I've done here is I've plotted wage growth by region, by sector, and then by skill. And what the red numbers are the lowest in the distribution. So if I did this by all the regions in the United States, the West South Central region is the slowest wage growth in the country in these regional data. And the Pacific, which is not going to be surprising to you, the Pacific is the fastest, and that's the gold. And then the overall is the blue. And what I want to point out is that this range doesn't seem very big. That it's true that Pacific is doing better than the South Central, the West South Central, but it's not as if the West is doing, or the Pacific is doing super well and everybody else is lagging behind, and so we better pay attention to the West because everybody else is going to catch up. That distribution is pretty tight around there as these things go. So there's nothing here that's suggesting that we're going to have runaway inflation because one region's going to push us that way. Looking to the next one, the distribution's even tighter. By sector, finance and business services is doing better than other groups, that's for sure, but education and health, which is the lowest growth rate or the slowest growth rate for wages, is not that far behind. So these distributions around the average are pretty tight, and that tells us as economists that we don't have sectors that are really getting ahead, and they're going to push up wage inflation in a way that we're not expecting. And then the final one I'll point to is skills. Now you always see a skill gap. High-skilled workers almost always get paid more, and then their wage growth is typically faster. But you can see that the high-skilled is not very much different than the overall, and the low-skilled is a little bit lower, but again, this distribution is pretty tight. So I didn't show this here, but if I plotted these same charts for periods when we were in, before the Great Recession, you would see these distributions being much wider. So these are fairly tight distributions around the average for these types of wages. And again, just to me, say that there's few signs that inflation or wage inflation is running away anywhere, and few signs that means overall inflation is around the corner. But if you remain a skeptic, and you think, well, you could get it wrong, there could be something here you haven't seen, then if you're not seeing it and it picks up, then we could get inflation before we could respond to it. I want to show you this final chart. I find this to be one of the most fascinating charts you can plot on inflation. So this is wage growth and inflation plotted since the 1970s all the way up to the most recent data we have, which is the second quarter of this year. And what you see, wage growth is in blue and inflation is in gold. And I want you to look at the plot, but then look at the two correlations at the top. So the correlation between wage growth and inflation prior to 1985 was 0.95. It's 0.946, but it's 0.95. That's high. So basically, wage inflation went up, inflation went up. And this was a decade or an era of what we often called cost push inflation. It was also a period of time where we had higher rates of unionization. And because of the higher rates of unionization and this spilled over to the broader economy, workers were getting cost of living adjustments. They were written into their contracts. So inflation would go up, that would go into the wages would go up, that would go into the inflation, and there was this sort of cost push wage price spiral. And that correlation was there, it was absolutely there. But now fast forward to after 1985, and you see that correlation drops to roughly 0.3, 0.291. And if I did a correlation, it's not really fair to do it on such a short period of time, so I didn't put it up on the slide, but if I did a correlation since 2012, it's 0.12. So the correlation's falling as we as we move forward in time. Now, why would the correlation fall, and how does that give us any confidence that if we did get inflationary pressures, wage inflation pressures, we could respond before they would reach runaway inflation, which is what we care about? Well, one of the reasons that research has found that this correlation has fallen is partly because we don't have these cost of living adjustments anymore that just run right into it. But the other is we're living in an era which economists fondly call, especially central bankers, fondly call the era of well-anchored inflation expectations. So essentially the mechanism goes like this. If the central bank commits to having low and stable prices and low inflation, and especially now that we have a 2% goal, then individuals and firms, consumers and firms, believe that's what's going to happen. They believe if inflation starts to go up, the Fed will come in and slow the economy and get inflation back to 2. And they believe if inflation goes down, then below 2, that the Fed will come in, stimulate the economy, and get it back up to 2. So if consumers and firms believe that, then that's an anchor that actually helps discipline policy, because firms don't want to respond and say, well, I think inflation is going to run away, or consumers don't say I have to buy that good today because it's going to be twice as much tomorrow. So this all is a disciplining device that allows this inflation just to hover around 2, despite the fact that wage growth may be moving. So that's one of the key reasons we find that the correlation between those things has gone down, in addition to the institutional changes that I mentioned, that we don't have these cost of living adjustments built in anymore. So if you summarize then about avoiding high inflation, and you came in and you were worried that maybe the Fed is getting behind the curve. That's something you hear a lot. Maybe the Fed's getting behind the curve, and a gradual pace of normalization, it wouldn't be sufficient because we could have inflation around the corner. I'm hoping these 3 slides have reassured you a little bit, because the 3 slides that just summarize are saying that wage inflation, which is a big driver of costs for firms, is just not going up very quickly. It's going up gradually, but it's not going up quickly. The second thing is we don't see any signs that it's going up very quickly across firms or regions or skill sets. So there's not a pocket of weakness or strength that would get your attention. And the final, and I think the most compelling evidence, is even if we saw wage growth sort of go up rapidly in a way that we're not anticipating, say that blue line did start to go up, it would take a while for that wage growth to funnel in or pass through to actual price inflation. And in that time, the monetary policymakers can respond to that and offset it. So that's the last piece of reassurance, I think, about this avoid high inflation or runaway inflation. So now on the other side of the equation, though, there are people who think maybe the Fed's getting behind the curve. because they're worried about inflation. And then on the other side of it, you might think, well, maybe the Fed is getting ahead, raising interest rates more quickly than is required or necessary, and we could be leaving people on the sidelines. And so this is, if you're a policymaker or you work for a central bank and you're in the research department, you ask yourself this question all the time. That's what doing good policy is. Are we getting to a place where we could have too much inflation, or are we getting to a place where we might be leaving people on the sidelines and we shouldn't do that? So now I want to turn to that one. Are we leaving people on the sidelines right now, and what are the prospects for that? So the best way to look at that, we looked at the unemployment rate, and I was asked this question earlier back before we started. Is the unemployment rate really a good measure? Because many people leave the labor force altogether, especially in the Great Recession, and then if they're not coming back, how should we think about them? So what we do as economists, and lots of people do this who aren't economists, is we look at not just the unemployment rate, but the labor force participation rate. And I want to, before I talk about what the details of the slide are, I just want to remind everybody, in case you forget, it's that the labor force participation rate, in order to be participating in the labor force, you have to say you're working or looking for work, right? Working or looking for work. So it's just a measure of how much people want to engage in the labor force. Because you might be out of the labor force for all kinds of reasons, raising a family, going to school, but this is, are you working or looking for work? And what we see is that, so I've plotted two lines here. Let me start with the top line, the gold line. That is what we call prime age workers. I used to say that so gleefully until I got closer to that end of that prime age, and now I say it with less glee. But it is still where we expect, the reason we call it prime age is this is where we expect people to be working. If they're going to work in their life, we expect them to work the most between 25 and 54, after their schooling is completed and before they start to think about retirement. So the gold line plots this prime age labor force participation rate. Men and women are in that together. And what you see is that it came down quite a bit. It's been on a downward trend, but it came down quite a bit after the Great Recession and has come up slightly since the Great Recession. You see a small cyclical increase. And I put the word slightly there because it really looks like a slight increase relative to the overall downward trend, or relative to the peak that we reached at the end of the 1990s. But then if you turn to aggregate participation, and that's everybody 16 and over, how many of those workers, what share of those workers is participating, what you see is that slight increase in prime age participation translates into a very slight, a barely increasing aggregate participation. And that's because the baby boomers are a powerful force. They're a silver tsunami of demographics, right? So they're going to exit the labor force, and even if we're getting a slight cyclical upturn, aggregate participation is going to be relatively, or has been relatively flat. So let me think about not just what we have today, but what's going to happen going forward. So here, we don't make our own labor force participation forecast, but the Congressional Budget Office does. And we do a lot of work to check to see if their forecasts are ones that we agree with, given the analysis that we bring. It's like making sure, doing robustness checks and making sure, yeah, that makes sense to us, and it completely does. So I've put their forecast there. So the first one at the top, the dotted line for the gold, is the forecast for the prime age workers. And what you see is that it sort of stays flat. There's no expectation that there's going to be additional cyclical recovery in participation going forward from the Congressional Budget Office for that group. And what you see in the bottom is that aggregate participation is forecast to go down. And that's because of the silver tsunami. That's because baby boomers, year after year, are going to withdraw from the labor force. They're a big age cohort. We don't have replacement cohorts coming in the same quantities. And so we're just going to have a reduction in our labor force participation because of that. That's the same thing as saying to you, and I'm sure you guys think about this in the financial planning world, that we're going to have a dependency ratio that's quite much higher than it has been historically, because we've got a lot of older workers to support, or older individuals to support, and children to support with fewer workers in the middle group. And so that's just going to change the dynamic of our economy. And one of the ways it's going to change the dynamic is we're going to have lower labor force participation going forward. But to return to the question about, do we have workers on the sidelines who might come in, I want to return to this line that the CBO forecasts. So you might ask, and I did, well, why don't we expect the labor force participation rate to go back to where it was before the recession? So go back to its 2007 level. Why did it stop short of getting back to that 2007 level? So my colleagues and I, and others in the Federal Reserve System and other academics have dug into this. And what we find is that some of the barriers for people participating are not cyclical, but structural. So what's a common structural barrier? Education. So a mismatch between the jobs available and the skills that people have to take those jobs. Another one that we found is that there are constraints to, so we compared, here's an example of how we did this. We compared our labor force participation rates to those in Canada. A close neighbor of ours, very similar economy. What we find is that in Canada, women in particular work a lot more than they do in the US. So when you trace back to why, it has a lot to do with more family-friendly policies that would allow you to have job holding when you left for your leave, it could be up to a year or two, they would hold your job. They would still get somebody to replace that job, but you would be able to come back to your firm. You're protected. There's additional child care provisions, a variety of other things. Taxes are different, a variety of things that maybe make it a little easier to go in and out of the labor force for child rearing, but not lose your position when you're gone. So whether we should adopt those policies or not, it's just an example of a structural barrier that might make it a little less easy for us to have that participation rate coming back up. What we do see is that the number of couples that have the potential to have two earners, so they're a couple, that actually do that fell quite a bit in the Great Recession. And some of that is just work-life balance choices. As we get wealthier, you might not want both people working. Others could be these structural barriers like I mentioned about families. And then the third structural impediment that we see is education. So if you're thinking about stoking the economy, make it really hot, run really hot in order to get more participants, there's not a lot of evidence that that's going to help, because if people have structural barriers, then running the economy hot is a blunt instrument. It's not going to be as effective as it might be if people were ready and just on the sidelines, and all we needed to do was incent employers to hire them. But, and this is the thing I'll leave you with before I take questions, is but we do have a lot of room to improve in terms of the longer run participation rate. And this is really important in our economy because it's going to affect how fast we can grow going forward. So this is simply a plot of labor force participation, that same thing I just showed you, but now I'm going back to 1992 because that's the period over which I can compare with other countries. And the blue line is the United States, and then I've shown you the United Kingdom, Canada, and Germany. And this is for prime age workers, 25 to 54. These economies are very similar in that they face the same challenges of, global competition, and they've got to manage with childcare and other kinds of things. They have the same upskilling. All the jobs are getting more technical, and so they have to have people that match those jobs. And yet, if you look at that chart, you can see that the U.S. is falling behind, that we really lag our competitor countries in terms of how much of our workforce, what fraction of our workforce participates in the economy, in the labor force, relative to these other competitor countries, or these what I consider our near neighbors on this. So there is room for improvement, and the reason this is so important to think about going forward is that if we can boost our growth rate right now is, I don't know if you noticed it, it's when I mentioned it, 1.8% is the potential growth rate that the median of the FOMC projections put forth. So our own at the San Francisco Fed is 1.8 as well. So 1.8 growth rate. We're used to 3 and 3.5, right? And you get to 1.8, and you think, how did we get there? Well, one reason is because the labor force used to grow at 1.5, 1%, and then we had productivity growth of 1.5 to 2%, and that's a growth rate that's far faster than we have right now. But our labor force growth rate right now is 0.5, because the baby boom's leaving and the cohorts coming in are small, 0.5, and then productivity growth's been 1, so that puts you at 1.5 potential growth, productivity plus labor force growth. And if you're thinking, well, productivity growth will pick up a little bit, you're still only at 1.8. So one way to bend that curve or change that speed limit, as I say, is to try to get more participants into the labor force. Try to get our participation rates up to where they are in other countries. So with that, I'll conclude just by summarizing that it's always fun to talk about the economy when it's doing well. And so I'm in one of those sweet spots right now. The economy is strong. Our outlook for the economy is bright. Inflation is at our target. It's at the 2% target. So the recent data, now we're looking for it to be a sustained achievement of 2%. But right now, this is very encouraging news. I have argued that there's very few signs of unwanted wage inflation. We want some wage inflation because that's the idea that workers are being paid their productivity. Productivity plus inflation should be the wage. So, but there's very few signs of unwanted wage inflation that would lead to unwanted price inflation. So there's not really a sign that we're overheating the inflation side of the economy. And there's little, if any, labor market slack. There's not a lot of room to run in terms of bringing additional people in just by stoking the economy up. But there is lots of room to grow, by my judgment, in terms of increasing participation more broadly. And that's just by comparing ourselves to other countries. So at that point, I'm happy to take questions. Yeah, let me just go right here to the back, and then I'll come to you.
Mary?
Yeah.
Since inflation is kind of, on the low side near the Fed's target, why don't we just run the economy hot?
That actually is the most popular question right now. Why don't we just stoke the economy? We've got low inflation, we've got loads of room to run, and in many ways, that's a really important thing to consider. We don't want to, and Chair Yellen said that when she was there, there's a little room to run. Chairman Powell has said that there's a little room for us to run. But why don't we just run wild, essentially? And there are several reasons. One is that people are worried about inflation will be slow, and then go up. But I wouldn't put that right now at the top of the list. There's others about financial stability. If you get misallocations in financial markets, if you run the economy super hot and beyond its capacity for too long. So that's something that President Rosengren has been talking about quite a lot. So if you're interested in reading about that, he's a president from the Boston Fed. He's talked about that quite considerably. But the third reason, and one that I think that's really near and dear to my own research, so I'll talk about it for a moment, is that we've learned a lot more about the potential to bring people, to misallocate investment in human capital. That's the simplest way to say it. So one of the things we found, and we've done this by research looking at fracking and looking at oil booms, looking at the housing boom, is when you run the economy super hot, above its capacity, what happens is young people come out of the school, they come out of high school, and they come out of college, and they go to get these jobs because you're doing financial planning. You know that financial literacy is not one of the highest skills we have in America or anywhere else for that matter. And so people are not making, it's not because we're not trying, it's because we tend to overemphasize the current and underestimate the future. So that happens with young people all the time. They come out of high school and they work because they can make a lot of money. They come out of college and they work because they can make a lot of money. But then what happens is we get the next recession, which inevitably happens, and they're left with lower human capital investment than they would have had, and they don't go back to school. And so one of the concerns that we have, in addition to worrying about inflation or worrying about financial stability, is that you don't want to end up running so hot that you end up creating incentives for people to misallocate their investments. And by that I mean misallocate their investments in themselves. So that's another reason that you might want to not run an economy that's too hot. Yes. And I'm sorry. I had you, and then I'll go to you, sir. Sorry, you're next. I think there's a microphone coming.
So I understand that there are few signs of unwanted wage inflation leading to unwanted price inflation, but what about something like tariffs and a trade war?
Sure.
How does that mess with expectations of what a central bank really can control?
Sure, absolutely. Great. That's a great question, very topical right now. Think about, let me just start with our forecast, okay? So, and this is we would not be unique if you looked at forecasters, variety of forecasters across the country. They're saying basically the same thing, that right now, the tariffs that have been put in place, the trade issues that have been put in place, have small effects on the economy because they're very targeted. And what happens is people substitute away from those goods oftentimes, or the producers take on the hit and don't pass it through. There's a lot of things that mediate or temper the overall effect. Plus, it's on a small set of goods and services, well, goods mainly, and so you essentially don't have a big impact on the economy. You do have a lot of pain in particular areas of the country, and you have a lot of pain on particular businesses. I mean, the one that I think we've been hearing a lot about is the nail manufacturer in Missouri that is closing down, and certainly prices are rising. You hear steel prices rising and other things, but we don't think right now that that is having a material effect on inflation or a material effect on GDP growth, largely because it's been small so far. Now, if you go to the very bad scenario, the worst case scenario, we're in an all-out trade war, then of course that has both inflationary effects and effects on growth. But when you think about those things, this before the worst case scenario, then we just don't see, even if they start to affect us, we're thinking about 1/10 of a percentage point on inflation. So instead of being at 2.1, it's more like 2.2, 2.3. That's the highest estimate I've seen across all estimates is 2.3 instead of something like 2.1 in core. So modest effects still there, but modest effects both on inflation and growth. If we have a trade war, the largest effects are going to be on growth. That's sort of the consensus there, is that what you end up having is we have global supply chains, we have all these interconnected ways that people produce and receive goods, and that's just going to grind to a halt, at least for some period. And that's going to constrain growth, and with slower growth, you're going to see less pressure on inflation. So if people just had to pay higher prices, it would feed into inflation, but if we had a full-out trade war, it would impede growth as well and aggregate demand.
So just to follow up on
Sure.
that, so I get the actual and close to trade war, but to what extent is the expected more immediate, perhaps more harmful in that sort of that dampening of animal spirits and expectation of what might be coming impacts growth?
Well, we haven't seen, so, I mean, maybe, so here's one of the, so let me think about how to answer this effectively, given all the things we've looked at. So I wanted to backtrack a minute. So one way that we look and see whether or not the discussions about any policy change, we've talked a lot of policy changes in the last decade, and one of the things we've learned is that when people are really nervous about policy changes, it shows up in these uncertainty measures. It shows up in the VIX, it shows up in Nick Bloom's uncertainty index. We just haven't seen those measures moving very much. And because of that, there is a lot of uncertainty here, but it's not showing up in a lot of uncertainty that so far is showing up in these uncertainty measures, which we would then think would affect real behavior. So what we've seen so far, what we've heard so far, which is why we haven't penciled in materially into our forecast either for inflation or growth, is that we're hearing, so we have lots of contacts in our 12th district, and we have lots of contacts, business contacts all over the country from the other reserve banks. And we ask them questions all the time, like, are you going to stop investing because you're worried about a trade war? And what you see is that if you're a nail manufacturer, you probably don't want to make another plant that's going to produce nails, but it's not affecting investment overall. In fact, the investment numbers have been pretty good. We don't see it affecting confidence in businesses or consumers, which are the things that show up in the real side of the economy. And we do see it coming up into prices of specific goods, but whether those prices of specific goods will be passed through to the final good. A lot of the goods that are being tariffed are intermediate inputs. And so whether that will show up into a final good or whether a producer will just eat the cost a little bit or pass it off in dribs and drabs across all the different endpoints through the different intermediate purchasers, it's just really hard to say. So right now, I would say there's a little bit of upside risk on inflation from that, but we've also had this period, a long period, where inflation was missing its target, which means that we still are balanced in our inflation outlook. We still think, we haven't hit 2% on a sustained basis, so I'm still, myself, waiting for that to be sustained. But there's this upside risk that the trade and tariff disruptions cause inflation to move up faster than we forecast. Does that help? Okay.
Thank you for this. This is great. Your chart on the inflation and wages was really fascinating about the correlation. You theorize that the lower correlation now is because of an expectation of government intervention. The government intervention that we've seen over the last 10 years, it's been temporary. I mean, and now the Fed and the Treasury are talking about removing it as painlessly as they can. So do you see a change in that dynamic? Do you see that expectation as being unfounded? Do you see any problems arising there?
So let me just restate that in a way that, so I would separate, and this is important because we've been talking about fiscal policy and trade policy, I would separate government from the Fed. And so to say that, so the government, the way I would characterize that, that's fiscal, our fiscal partners. Those are policies like trade policy and the TARP and all the interventions that were done during after the Great Recession, and of course the tax cuts and things like that. That's all on what I would call the government side. And then there's the Fed Reserve side. What did the Fed do in monetary policy? So first is lower the interest rate, but we have a zero lower bound, at least effectively. We don't charge negative interest rates for banks to have reserves. So we cut the interest rates to zero, and then we engage in quantitative easing, build up the balance sheet. And that is all by way, we do a lot of forward guidance. If you read the statements that the FOMC put out, it's about telling people we're going to keep interest rates low for a long time until we see these different things happen in the economy. That's all meant to telegraph to markets and to consumers and to businesses that the Fed is serious about accommodating the economy and stimulating the economy so that we can achieve our dual mandates, both the full employment and the low and stable, but not deflation. So that all seems to have worked. And then what you see now, the removal of that accommodation, it's not because, I don't assume it will be disruptive because the economy is getting its own legs under it. So the Fed was necessary, these interventions were necessary to help the economy along when the economy itself is faltering. But once the economy's got its legs under it, and I think there's a lot of evidence that it does, then you can remove this accommodation and the economy can go along on its own. And if you continue to stimulate an economy that's getting its own lift, then you can actually end up going the other way, which is to have an economy that's growing too quickly, unbridled, and then you have to pull back on the reins pretty abruptly. And we know historically, abrupt pullbacks on the reins of an economy don't end well. So this is why heading for a sort of a soft landing is a way people often will say it, is what the gradual normalization is meant to do. So you put it out as if you remove it, would you expect people to become worried about inflation expectations? I would say it the other way. I would say if we didn't start to remove some of the accommodation, we might think inflation expectations drifted up too far. Right now, for a long time, we were worried that they would drift under 2, that they wouldn't think 2 was the credible target because inflation was low, but keep stimulating and inflation expectations didn't move. But if you go for a long time where you're doing nothing and the economy's going gangbusters, you might worry that they drift on the other side. And that people come to expect what they expected in the 70s, which is double-digit inflation. That's definitely a situation you don't want to get into. So it's all about a balancing act, making sure that it's not too low and the anchor drifts down, and making sure it's not too high and the anchor moves up.
Thank you. My question is about the rates market and how the Fed incorporates signals from the rates market into its decision making. Specifically, for example, if you look at the front end of the OIS market right now, what it shows is a couple more hikes, 2 or 3 through the end of next year, and then a 15 to 20% chance of a rate cut in the first half of 2020. So you painted a very rosy picture of the economy, and I'm wondering how the Fed looks at the yield curve and signals from the yield curve in making its decisions, and do you think that basically what the yield curve is saying is wrong, which is that we're going to continue in this rosy environment for the next 12 to 18 months, and then we're going to have a significant enough slowdown that would require an easing of policy?
So let me just tell you how we think about this question. So let me start with the yield curve, just what do we know about the yield curve? There's some really interesting research, fascinating. People have done this for a long time, but there's a great economic letter produced by our bank. I'm not saying it's great because it's our bank. It's produced by 2 colleagues of mine, and they've done this really nice analysis that just show that the yield curve is a perfect predictor of a recession. When the yield curve inverts, then you get a recession. That's just the way the data square. But then you have to go back and ask, okay, why does that happen? Why do you get a recession when the yield curve inverts? And there's no answers. There's no causal relationship that any of the research has been able to point to. But one of the things people point to is that you get behind the curve, the Fed gets behind the curve. You know, the yield curve is inverting for lots of reasons, but one reason it can invert is because we're moving short rates up, the Fed's moving short rates up really fast, and long rates don't have a chance to respond. And so you invert the yield curve, and then, you know, it predicts a recession almost perfectly. So that's certainly on the minds of people, and we don't have in our own forecast in San Francisco, and I don't think many Feds do that I've been able to see, have an inverted yield curve in the forecast because of this, that the policy normalization is very gradual, and that markets are learning, and you see the long end moving up with the short end moving up, although not one for one. And then recently, the long end is coming back down, and people are getting nervous. But our own look at it suggests that the long rate's being affected now by a flight to safety. So you get political disruptions and other things, and that long end comes down. But our expectation is that the long end is going to move back up when that flight to safety, which is a temporary issue, is removed. The long end comes up, and you're back to this point where you're not going to end up with an inverted yield curve.
I'm talking about the inversion of the front end. Because if you look at the front end of the yield curve, it's already inverted in 2020, where you look at the 1-month rate 18 months forward, and it starts to actually go down.
Well, part of it is that the policy forecast, I think, if you looked at the SEP, let me show you this for a second. Part of it could be, so one of the things we know about OAS and others is that there's movement on the short end of the rates right now for technical reasons. Just lots of different things going on that are moving these rates around for technical reasons. So I don't want to put too much emphasis on that. But let me look, this is the main thing I would want you to look at. So in the end of this projection here, you can see that the rate has gone above 2.9. So 2.9 in the median was the long run neutral rate of interest plus inflation. That was the nominal funds rate. And this nominal funds rate, which is in the projections, the SEP projections, is higher. So the expectation that markets will read from this is that the Fed will first overshoot the nominal funds rate, its long run, and then they'll have to make some rate cuts. But it won't be because the economy is weakening as much as the calibration of the soft landing, right? That you've got so much momentum in the economy, and then you need to sort of bridle it. So you overshoot the nominal funds rate for a short period, but then you have to make rate cuts to get back down to 2.9. So I would read it that way myself, and that it's not about it doesn't, by my understanding or my argument, it doesn't suggest that the picture on the economy is going to get less rosy. It's just about how do you orchestrate a soft landing. And one way you do it is you overshoot to bridle, but then you have to come back down to the nominal funds rate to keep things on a steady plane. And so that would make the short end of the curve look odd in 3 month, 1 year, and 2 year. Yes, and then there. And
I was just interested in your chart around the correlations between the correlation between the wage growth and full employment, mm-hmm. and that the correlation is basically on its way to zero. And I'm just curious if the Fed has the two goals around price stability and full employment, and that's really come from a time where those correlations were much higher so that you could kind of measure that. How do you feel you're going to have more ways to really look and help balance these two when that correlation no longer exists? And that's the basic question.
Well, I think that's a really important question. And Chairman Powell said something about this in his speech in Portugal, and he said, not about that specific point, but he just made the point, and I think I completely, this is how we do our work now. A lot of things in our economy have changed. And so the simple correlations that that we were used to, we have to almost recalibrate. But it doesn't mean we have to throw them out. So we have some standard things in our toolkit. Okun's Law, which tells you about the relationship between GDP and unemployment. We have the Phillips curve, which tells you the relationship between inflation and unemployment. That relationship still holds. If I came up here and I plotted for you a history of the last 30 years, and I only used annual data, and I showed you the relationship between unemployment and wage inflation, what you would see is that the Phillips curve, that's called the Phillips curve, it largely works. You see that when labor markets get tight, firms raise wages, that rate causes increases in wage growth, and that ultimately factors into price inflation. So roughly that relationship works. It's not as if the whole world is broken, but what's happened is that other things are putting wedges into that correlation. And one thing that puts a big wedge into that correlation is the fact that inflation expectations are, well, inflation's low, first of all. It's 2% instead of 14 or 12 or 11 or something, or 9, so it's low. It's also, so it's going to fluctuate just less around, with unemployment if it's staying around 2. Unemployment goes up and down, and inflation's going to be like this. The second thing is that if we have a strong central bank and a credible central bank, then you're going to see inflation not vary too much from 2. So this all brings us back to the question, then how do we know if we're at our max in terms of achieving price stability and full employment? And I would argue that price stability is easy. You say, I want it to be 2 on average, and so sometimes it's going to be a little above 2, sometimes it's going to be a little bit below 2, but we want it to be 2 on average. And so that one's easy. And then you have to say, well, how do we know we've reached full employment if we can't actually use the wage inflation or price inflation to calibrate it? And so what I do is this. So I use those tools. I think those tools are helpful. But I also ask, what do we know about what the unemployment rate should be? And here's how a labor economist would do this. They wouldn't use inflation. They wouldn't use a Phillips curve. They would do it this way. It's the way I was trained to do it. You look at unemployment rates across different demographic groups, and usually age and gender. But age is the big one. We know that younger workers take longer to find jobs than older workers. So unemployment rates are just higher for younger workers because there's a lot more people in frictional unemployment searching for jobs. So we tend to think younger workers have those higher frictional rates of unemployment, older workers have lower ones. We simply break the population into, workers 16 to 24, 24 to 35, et cetera, and then we ask what are the unemployment rates of those workers on average, and then we multiply them by the shares of those types of workers in the economy. And that's why the natural rate of unemployment, if I simply did it that way, you would see downward pressure on the natural rate of unemployment simply because the population is getting older. So when the baby boom was in its teenage years and its early working years, the natural rate of unemployment was high, and it's coming down. If you think about education as another variable, there's a lot of debate about whether you should use it, but education is a really good indicator of how high your unemployment rate is going to be. So if I put on education in there, higher educated workers have lower unemployment rates, they find jobs quickly, less educated workers take longer. So those two factors, age and education alone, can explain why the unemployment rate has been drifting down. So if I do that simple analysis and I don't have anything about inflation, it tells me there's a range because it depends on how long you average unemployment rates over, what's the window length of your years of your sample. But if you do any of those calculations, you get a natural rate of unemployment that looks somewhere between 4.4 and 4.8. So 4.5 is a pretty good estimate. I mean, these confidence bands around these things are wide. So, but what I want to point out, how I wanted to respond to your question is it's not just about inflation. It's also about ground up or bottom up accounting. And there you still see that we are running an unemployment rate that seems lower than we would have expected from these types of things I just mentioned, like the age and education distribution of the population. Now, one reason that the unemployment rate can run a little lower is because we have been pulling in some workers from the labor force, out of the labor force, they're moving in. But when that stops, then unemployment will start to drift down even more, and that will be, putting a lot more pressure on it. But does that answer your question? That's how you do it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, but I think what I wonder about is when the sort of traditional
Well,
And so that's, so sort
Yeah.
of more around that question.
yeah, okay. I'm sorry, I gave you a very detailed answer then to the unemployment question, but
I mean, what
As
you
an
said is
example.
very interesting and helpful, but I guess my question was really more around just what I said.
okay, so that's a great question, and let me, if you don't mind, I'll just kind of restate it in a more general way, which is, so after the Great Recession, people looked at economists and said, what? How did you not know this? How did you not see this coming? Are your models broken? You know, you're going to be data dependent. Where, you know, what are your models even telling you? And it made people do, economists by and large do these sort of core introspections where what are we missing, and do we need to update our models? And the answer is, of course, we need to update our models. But it doesn't mean that the standard relationships don't make any sense. So we can still use the basic intuition that when a labor market gets tight, then there's more pressure to raise the price. You know, if demand far outstrips supply, the price should rise. So that's fundamental economic principle still holds, but there are more things that are impeding its thing, and it's your ability to observe it in real time. So then if you're a policymaker, what do? And I would say that policymakers now have to have a full dashboard of things they're looking at. So one thing you would consult, and this is how we do our business, you consult the full slate of empirical models, things that have worked historically forever. Another thing you do is you look at theoretical models and say, well, what if the world didn't look like it does historically, but looked different as we're hearing from anecdotal information or from just the last couple of years of data? Let's run an experiment with a theoretical model, and let's do a simulation and see what would happen. Another thing we do is the kind of stuff I showed you here, which is just an example of it. It's looking at microdata. So we tend to look at these big aggregates, and that's where our correlations come from, but you can look at more microdata down to the state level or the industry level, and you can say, maybe I can learn something from this industry, which I think is one of the changing sectors, and see if I can learn something about how to apply it to the aggregate economy. So it really becomes, if you're a policymaker, you have to look at all of these things simultaneously. You also have to talk to your business contacts, and you have to somehow be able to summarize that information and make a decision about what to do. But this is just this is only my opinion, not based on anything but sort of doing this work, is that it does make you more gradual. You want to see things in the data before you move on them. So an example of that would be, that I would underscore for you, is that Chairman Powell said in his press conference, I certainly have said it myself, that you're looking for sustained achievement of 2% inflation. If you were just relying on your models, you would think that we hit 2 and we're good and we're fine. But we were actually gradually increasing rates, in part because we're looking for the sustained relationship, because we're not saying, well, the models are telling us everything. Does that make sense? The final thing I'll say as an example is that the fiscal stimulus is a good example of this. Fiscal stimulus, the models would tell us that we should be getting a huge boost from this, but we've only penciled in 2.8% growth. If you were just using history, you'd think it'd be something on the order of 3.5 or more, but you have to take into account that we're in a world where we're in the 9th year of an expansion, and stimulus on a hot economy is not the same as stimulus on a recessionary economy. So it's calibrating these models that are about historical averages with the actual data you see and with the situation, the state that you're in at that moment. One more? I have one more. Okay. You won the magic card.
Thanks for this
Better make it
presentation.
good, so it's the last one. Just kidding.
Something that I certainly come across in the press a lot is, with regard to interest rate setting, is whether or not the Fed has enough ammo to fight off the next downturn.
Yes.
And notwithstanding the positive outlook at the moment, I'm just wondering, is that just the press talking, or is that an actual consideration that goes to this balancing act that you have to consider setting monetary policy?
So this is an absolute, I don't think it's phrased the same way. It's not, do we have enough ammo to fight off the next downturn? It's more, what is in our toolkit to fight off the next downturn? So if you're in a world where inflation is low, 2%, and the real interest rate is low, right? Nominal funds rate's going to be low, so R star. So if you're in a world where R star is 0.9, our current estimate is 0.5, then you're looking at a nominal funds rate of 2.5. So now you get the next shock, or 2.9, let's just use the SEP, 2.9. You get the next shock, negative shock. That doesn't give you a lot of room to move the funds rate and stimulate the economy. So that's the zero lower bound problem. It's been something people have thought about a lot, and they're thinking about it a lot more now and studying it. But then it's about what toolkits did we learn about when we were trying to react to the Great Recession. And one of the toolkits, well, in our toolkit we have these things. The balance sheet, quantitative easing. So we have the nominal funds rate, which we can lower. We have the balance sheet, quantitative easing, which was shown to have some positive effects. We have forward guidance, just being able to talk to the markets about the expectation of how long rates will remain low, or what the thresholds are. I don't know if you remember back when the statements were talking about the rates will be this until unemployment achieves some level. So it's just about those types of tools, and it's not, in our world, we're studying those quite a bit and figuring out which ones are the most effective and the most likely to be needed when we do get the next inevitable downturn. Hopefully, nothing at the magnitude of the Great Recession. So one of the things that's also on the mind when you think about this balancing act is ensuring that you do as much work as possible to achieve the soft landing, so that when we do inevitably get the next downturn, it's going to be more modest and not so great that you really have to bring every single toolkit out, every single tool in your kit out to fight it. So that's why the balancing act right now is so important. You definitely want to avoid bubbles. You always want to avoid bubbles, but just coming off of one, we definitely want to avoid another. And you also want to avoid, pulling up too short and leaving some people on the sidelines. So thank you for this. It was a great set of questions. Appreciate it.